The missionary needed a vacation desperately. But where do you go for relaxation and recreation when you live in the middle of Swaziland under the shadow of Pig's Peak? There's grasslands and wastelands on every turn and wild animals in every direction. Where do you go to take a break? Well, you go where the Swazis go, and that's down to the Kamadi River on a beautiful sandbar. And the missionary got his two young boys together, and along with about a half a dozen national pastors, and they made their way to the Kamadi River, and there on that beautiful sandbar, they built up a big fire that would burn for the next 2 weeks. All during the day, they roamed the bushveld and out across the grasslands, and they looked for zudu and deer and lion, and they talked and chatted and told stories, and they had the time of their life. It was a part of the rules of the camp that on your way back in from the hunt, you always look for pieces of ironwood, and you pick them up and you bring them in and you put them in a pile and you keep feeding the fire, and they fed the fire. And after days, that fire bed would get so large, and the ash bed and coal bed would get 4 inches, 6 inches, 8 inches deep. They're now a week into the hunt, and it's at night, and they're sitting on that sandbar surrounding that beautiful fire. The ash bed is deep. The coals are glowing at least 8 inches deep. It's a massive fire to drive away the chill of the African night. The eagles, the bats are chirping above. The hippopotamus are splashing in the river. And Joseph, one of the national pastors, the best storyteller of them all, is telling this amazing story. The missionary's son, Elmer, is sitting, leaning back. His back is resting against Joseph's knees that are pulled up to his chest. And Elmer is sitting and almost like he's in a recliner, leaning back against Joseph's knees, listening, enthralled by the story that Joseph is telling. He's staring straight ahead into the fire. In the middle of that story, 10-year-old Elmer is gazing into those coals when all of a sudden he sees something extremely strange taking place in front of his eyes. The ash bed, the coals literally rise up from the earth, as if something is pushing or shoving from underneath, almost like a wave of the ocean went under the fire and lifted it, and it went back down. He thought, what have I witnessed? And he sort of takes those bare feet and pushes against the sand and snuggles back deeper into Joseph's knees when all of a sudden it happens again. As he's prepared to start getting up and moving away from the fire, having no idea what's happening, all of a sudden, coming from underneath those red-hot coals, as a giant king cobra pushing through that ash bed, pushing up through those red-hot coals, rising about 3 feet of its length into the fire, only to collapse back into the fire. What they did not know is that they had built their campfire right over the winter burrow of a giant king cobra. When that fire began to burn, the radiant heat began to work its way down into the sand. 6 inches, a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. And finally it was at the center of that burrow, and the cobra could bear the heat no longer, and it had to come out. Well, there was chaos around that campfire for a moment. Finally, they understood what had happened, and everybody was back in their place, and Elmer was once again leaning against Joseph's knees. But Joseph didn't pick up where he left off on the story. He reached his giant black hands and placed them on Elmer's shoulders, and he said this. That deep, resonant voice, he said, "Missionary son, there has been a wonderful lesson played out in front of us tonight." He said, in our journey with God, there may come sin in our lives, sin that we keep under cover, sin that nobody knows about. But he said, every time we're confronted with the fiery presence of the Almighty, that sin will move and we will be confronted with it and we will know it's there. Missionary son, keep your heart clean from such sin. The Bible understands this truth very clearly. As a matter of fact, the story of coming clean and keeping clean is very, very front and center in the Bible. You don't have to walk too many pages down through the book of Genesis till you find a man and a woman who've sinned against God, and they're hiding, and God is searching them out, trying to find them, probing with questions. What have you done? Who told you this? Where are you? And finally the story comes tumbling out. Another 12 chapters or so, and you're into the life of Abraham, and he's got this secret covenant, this secret sin that he's settled with his wife. And finally, when he's confronted by Abimelech, the story comes tumbling out. When Israel tried to take Ai, they were defeated. And Joshua begins to dig, and he finds that the root of the problem is in some gold and a silver wedge and a Babylonian garment buried in the tent of one Achan. And finally, after lengthy ceremonies and searching, it all comes tumbling out. King David, the mightiest in the land, the man with a heart after God, took another man's wife and murdered his best friend. He thought he had it well hidden, but the scripture says his bones literally would melt within him. And then the faithful prophet walks in one day and tells the story of the little lamb. You know the story. And David responds in anger to such a thing. And Nathan says, thou art the man. And the truth comes tumbling out. Confession is a healthy thing. Clearing our hearts, confessing sin is extremely important to solid spiritual health. The New Testament writers understood it. James and John, they were considered pillars in the church. They wrote some of the earliest epistles, and both of those letters to the early church contain crucial information. James said it this way: confess your sin one to another. Pray one for another that you might be healed. John said it like this: if we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. You put those two together and you get both the vertical and the horizontal issues of confession. Confession to God, confession to man. Paul added this when he wrote to the Corinthians after chastising them about dealing with sin. He said, oh, see what earnestness this godly sorrow has produced in you. Yea, what eagerness to clear yourselves. Any man and woman who walks in spiritual health is eager to keep clean in their heart. Something really valuable happens when we confess our sin. Confessors find a freedom deniers never have. Confession's not a positive word to some people. It may not be to you. It may conjure up images of a finger-wagging confrontation in a very unpleasant place. It may conjure up images of interrogation and torture, or walking the aisle and being forced to say something in public, or having your mom and dad say, well, you've got to make this right, so we're going to make sure. And you're forced into a situation where you have to confess very reluctantly, though you do, and get it done. But you know, the word confession simply means to say the same thing as another, to agree. It just simply means I agree with God that I am what He says I am. It's sort of like waving the white flag of surrender to heaven. Yes, I am what you say I am. What you tell me in that quiet, still voice in my heart, the thing that nudges on me and how my conscience troubles me, yes, that is true about me. That is accurate. I am that kind of man. I have, in fact, done that. That's confession. Confession is not telling God something He doesn't already know. We talk about secret sin. That's an absolute misnomer. There is no such thing. The eyes of Him who walks to and fro across the world sees into the innermost secrets and sanctity of our life. He knows the moment you double-click on that little icon. He knows the moment in the darkness when a thought occurs, when an act happens. He knows. There are no such things as secret sin. You never tell God something He doesn't already know. You say, since He already knows it, why do I tell Him? That's the beauty of confession. It's not necessarily speaking something. It's bringing my heart in alignment and agreeing with Him that I am what He says I am. This is true. Confession is not blaming. It's not pointing fingers at others without pointing fingers at me. Feels good to sort of defend myself. The sinful heart has an infinite capacity to justify whatever it wants to justify. Well, if it hadn't have been for that extremely hard, unbearable, impossible requirement in that class, I would not have plagiarized. That makes you feel good. You kind of justify yourself. Well, after all, the resources were so limited and there were only so few, so what do they expect? All these dumb rules around here, do they think anybody could keep this stuff? We have an infinite capacity to justify whatever we want to justify. It's not blaming or pointing fingers. Confession is not penance. Penance is an act of self-abasement to show sorrow or compensate for my sin. It's not crawling around 30 times on the chapel floor until your knees are raw. It's not some dehumanizing, humiliating act. We can only practice confession in the context of grace. Any other approach is deadly. When confession springs out and it's not in the context of grace, it becomes a legalistic, driving, awful thing. People even maneuver to out-confess the other. Some even think of some terrible sin they didn't commit so they can out-confess the other. No. Confession must be practiced in the context of grace. David said it like this. He said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, try my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me." Self-examination is important. A life that's not evaluated is a life that's not worth living. But the danger in self-examination, when it's not tied to the grace of God, it leads to two extremes. It leads to self-condemnation on the one hand. You never get out from under the guilt. You're constantly condemning yourself. Or it leads to self-justification on the other hand. But in the middle of those two extremes is true, healthy, biblical confession where I agree with God. I have done, I am what He says I have done, what He says I am, and I make it right vertically and horizontally. Confession is coming clean. A woman asked Billy Sunday one time, "Why do you keep having revival meetings? Over and over and again, you just keep having, what do you keep having revival meetings?" He said, "Why do you keep taking baths?" And he's right. We need moments of God intersecting our life in certain ways, not only to make sure we get clean, but to keep us clean. There was a Chinese man who had tried everything in the world to stop the stabbing headaches he was experiencing, but nothing helped. Finally, after 4 long years, he went to the hospital and they took an x-ray, and the x-rays revealed that he had a 4-inch knife blade buried between the scalp and the skull behind his right ear. They were shocked. He was shocked. But he did remember 4 years ago that a robber had confronted him with a knife and had swung the knife at him, but what he did not know was that the knife had actually hit him and gone inside and broke off. He knew there was a laceration behind his ear, a small cut just a ½ inch long or so. He had cleaned it up and wiped it up and it stopped bleeding. But after 4 long years, under the eyes of an x-ray machine, they found the troubling blade. You bury misbehavior, you can expect pain. Hide your sin, and you'll experience a knife blade to your soul. For Achan, that meant digging up the hidden stuff and cleaning out the foreign matter of his tent. For David, it meant removing the knife blade of conviction that was stabbing his heart. You see, confessors find a freedom. Deniers do not. Coming clean has vertical and horizontal ramifications. Vertical means I come clean with God. Some people don't mind that part. Well, at some point I might as well agree I am what God said I am, so okay, let's get things cleared up with God. And so they find a spot, they tell God they're sorry, and off they go. We must tell God the truth. You say, why do I have to tell him? He already knows it. Because the telling of it proves my agreement. I am what you say I am. I admit this. I acknowledge this. I have failed. I have sinned. Forgive me, Lord. I agree with you. But it doesn't stop there. It's horizontal. It means coming clean with others. At the very heart of confession is a desire to rectify the consequences of my actions. Now, if those actions have nothing to do with anything but you and God, then that's where it stops. But to be honest, that's rarely the case. Rarely. I'm cleaning out some things as I prepare a departure. I was going back into some files I hadn't touched in years, and I reached into a file and pulled out a folder, and it took me back almost 30 years. I was on a judiciary committee that was examining the failures of a pastor. I remember that tug of war. The pastor would not, he didn't want to talk about it. He wouldn't speak about it. He just kept pointing to the faults of how it was being dealt with, and he was right on that count. But what he would never do, he just simply would make this statement. He said, it's all under the blood, it's all under the blood, it's nobody else's business. Until this day, that shadow lingers over him because he wouldn't come clean horizontally. The Old Testament had laws for the offering of sacrifice for sin, but it also had restitution toward the offended. Do I have to confess my sin to another person? I know that question is rooted in genuine inquisitiveness to know what needs to be done, but I also know it can often be rooted in pride. I don't want anybody to know. I think people who ask that question are sort of operating under this mechanical notion of a relationship to God, very mechanical. We need to answer that question. I need to relieve your mind in some of those areas, but I want you to know that, first of all, if you're saved, you're saved. If you're a Christian, you're a Christian. However, I nor anyone else can tell when you've crossed the line of rebellion and disobedience in your heart toward God. I don't know that. I do know this. God is very long-suffering, and He will work with you and poke you and needle you and speak to you. Then He'll back away for a time being. Then He'll come again and talk to you about this. It's possible something could go on for years. Matter of fact, I know it can. I know from personal experience it can, and I also know from my experience here. I have had students. I had a student write me when I came here. They were a student in the 1950s. Had stolen a songbook out of the bookstore and had never paid for it. They had been in the ministry for 40-something years, and they're just now paying for a songbook. What in God's name could keep a man or a woman 40 years from paying for a songbook? I tell you, spiritual pride. I don't want anybody to think less of me. I don't want anybody to feel any way. I don't want anybody to know. We need to confess our sin to someone else. If I know I've sinned against another, then I must confess to that person. If I come to the altar to bring my gift and there remember that I have aught against my brother or he has aught against me, leave my gift and go to my brother. The core is reconciliation. You say, well, he don't even know about it. You might be surprised. After hearing a sermon on confession, a man approached his pastor with a very heavy conscience, and he asked his pastor what he should do. He said, I am a boat builder. I help build expensive wooden craft. And he said, some years ago I stole some very expensive brass nails. But he said, I can't tell my employer. He said, there's two reasons. Number one, I'll lose my job. Number two, he'll think I'm a hypocrite for all the times I did share my faith. And then I had this hidden. So I don't want to lose my job, and I want him to think I'm a hypocrite. Well, finally, the guilt got so bad, he went to his employer and confessed anyway. He brought with him the money to pay for the nails to make restitution for what he had done. And here's what his unbelieving boss said. He said, sir, I always did think you were nothing but a hypocrite. But now, I began to feel there's something in this Christianity after all. Any religion that would make a dishonest workman come back and confess that he'd been stealing copper nails and offer to settle for them, that must be a religion worth having. I can tell you most stories, and we've got time to talk about in chapel. Everything from men who stole from large corporations and after retirement got saved and knew that stealing was a zero-tolerance issue in their company, and for him to confess it would mean he could lose his pension, he could lose everything, a significant thing. Yet, walking into the president of the company's office who'd flown in on a Learjet the day before, and in front of the president was the letter he had written ahead of time and a check inside that letter for thousands of dollars to replace what he had stolen. The president had every right in the world to fire him, to keep the check, and to annul his pension. But the president said, "Sir, I know many people have stolen from our company over the years, but I know of no one who's written a check to pay it back." He said, "I understand more about this than you think I do. My mother was a Christian woman." He said, "Here, keep your check. Your pension's in place. God bless you." Do they all turn out that good? Nope. But confessors have a freedom. Deniers do not. When I have a besetting sin that betrays the trust placed in me, I should confess it to whoever is an authority above me. I don't know what's so confusing about this to students. I never found it confusing as a student. I always generally seemed to know who I was under their authority. If you've broken a rule in the dorm, you don't go to your RA. They don't have that kind of authority. You don't go to your friend over here, your peer, your roommate, and say, "I broke a rule in the dorm. I feel so sorry." Well, yeah, that's catharsis. You go to the dean of women. You go to the dean of men. If it's higher than that, then you go to the dean of students. If it's higher than that, you come to me. You come to someone who has the authority to say, "You're clear. You're clear." Max Lucado, whose writings probably many of you have read, grew up in a home of alcoholics. He actually drank all during his college years. He said after he left college and was headed to seminary to become a preacher, he said, "I decided, preachers probably shouldn't be drinking." And he stopped drinking. Now, there's a lot of questions here I don't know how to answer, so we'll talk about this one later. But he stopped drinking. He went through seminary, no alcohol, went into his pastorate in Texas, didn't drink for years. I'm not sure the timeline, but it was a considerable number of years had passed. He said one day it was a blazing 100 degrees in a Texas sun, and I was driving down one of the streets in my community, and I looked, and there was a 7-Eleven store. Of course I knew the store was there, but in the window they had this huge bottle of beer that was frosty and ice cold. He said, "I can't explain, but when I looked at that, I wanted it." And he said, I turned my car in, went inside, bought a beer, put it in a brown bag, well concealed, came out and sat in the parking lot and drank that beer, kind of doing this. He said, "I drove away feeling terrible." He said, "I felt terrible enough not to do it again for another week. And then the next week I did it again. And then twice in the same week." He said the second time, he said, "When I was walking out of that store with that little brown bag covering my bottle of beer," he said, "God the Holy Spirit zeroed in on me and said, 'You hypocrite.'" He said, "I threw that beer in a trash can." He said, "I went back to the church." He said, "I repented to God. I confessed my sin. I asked God to forgive me." He said, "Then I called a meeting of the Board of Elders. And all those men that are elders in my church sat in that room, and I stood up in the middle of them and told them what I'd done. And then I sat down a broken man." He said, "The chairman of the Board of Elders walked behind me, laid his hands on my shoulders, and said, 'Max, what you did was wrong. You should not have done this. But we forgive you.' And they prayed for him there. The following Wednesday night, in the Wednesday evening service of his church, he stood up before the entire body, told the entire body what he'd done. Can you imagine the shock of hearing your pastor tell that story? He turned and he knelt, and the congregation came around him and prayed for him and forgave him. Wow. But confessors have a freedom deniers do not. You see, there are 1,000 little stories like that covered up in lives of Christians everywhere. But when you fully come clean, when you fully confess, you can write that story in the pages of Christianity today. Are you getting my point here? Confessors have a freedom deniers do not. Some of you have already had sex with your girlfriend and you know it's wrong and you've violated the laws of God and you know it.